Can you imagine sitting on a plane, watching a child smile with innocence, only to see that joy shattered in an instant by the sting of a stranger's hand? What unfolds next forces everyone on board to face a choice: turn away in silence, or rise against cruelty, even when the whole world seems to favor the powerful. This story begins with a shocking act. A wealthy, influential man striking a young black boy, certain that his status would shield him from consequence. But in that moment of fear and disbelief, one stranger stood up, not with fists, but with courage, and changed the trajectory of countless lives. Picture yourself in that cabin. If it were your child, your grandchild, your family, what would you do? Which side of that choice would define who you are? This is not just a story about a flight gone wrong. It is about justice, dignity, and the ripple effect of one brave decision. Stay with us, because what followed shook an empire and reminded the world that silence can be broken. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin this journey together. The cabin lights glowed with that dim, bluish hue every traveler knows. Engines hummed steadily as the jet pushed off the runway at JFK, climbing into the night sky over New York. Passengers adjusted seatbelts, shifted trays, tugged at blankets. It was a cross-country trip, bound for San Francisco, 5 hours suspended in the air. In seat 2A sat Malcolm Rivers, a man most strangers would never guess was a CEO. He wasn't flashy. He wore a simple navy sweater, jeans, and a pair of well-worn sneakers. A black man in his early 40s. His posture was relaxed, yet grounded. Years of building a tech company from scratch had taught him to carry both weight and calm at the same time. Beside him, in the window seat, was his 8-year-old son, Isaiah. The boy pressed his forehead against the glass, eyes wide at the city lights shrinking below. Isaiah had a gentle presence, with that mixture of curiosity and fragility that parents guard with their whole soul. His health had always been delicate. A mild neurological condition meant regular checkups and careful routines. But tonight, Isaiah was simply a child, thrilled by clouds and twinkling dots of light. For Malcolm, trips like these were more than business. He had board meetings waiting in San Francisco. Yes, but bringing Isaiah along was a promise he made after too many years of missed dinners and late nights. The boy's soft voice pulled him out of spreadsheets and investor calls. It reminded him what mattered. Flight attendants moved briskly down the aisle, offering drinks. Laughter drifted from a cluster of businessmen in first class, their voices tinged with arrogance and too much whiskey. Malcolm noted it, then turned back to his son, asking gently if he wanted apple juice or water. That was when it happened. Isaiah, shifting to reach his cup, brushed the armrest of the man in 2B. The man, a tall, broad-shouldered white passenger in an expensive gray suit, snapped his head around. His face was already red from alcohol. His name, Malcolm would later learn, was Charles Denton, a real estate mogul who believed the world bent to his will. Charles sneered, and before Malcolm could react, the man's hand whipped across the space smack. The sound cracked through the cabin. Passengers froze. Isaiah's head snapped back, his small hand flying to his cheek. His eyes widened, not just in pain, but in stunned disbelief. "You people never learn," Charles hissed, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through silence. "Teach your boy some manners." For a moment, the cabin seemed suspended in time. No one moved. No one spoke. The hum of the engines filled the void. Malcolm's breath caught in his chest. Every muscle in his body urged him to stand, to retaliate, to shield his son from further harm. But years of navigating boardrooms where one wrong expression could cost everything taught him restraint. His hand reached first for Isaiah, pulling the boy close, whispering, "It's okay. Son, you're safe with me." Isaiah trembled, eyes shining with tears that hadn't yet fallen. He whispered back, voice shaking, "Daddy, did I do something wrong?" The question sliced deeper than the slap. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He lifted his eyes, locking on Charles Denton. In that stare was not rage, but something quieter, heavier resolve. Around them, whispers stirred. A woman in row 3 gasped. A young man fumbled with his phone, uncertain if he should record. Flight attendants glanced at one another, hesitation painted on their faces. And then, from 2 rows back, came the sound of a seatbelt snapping open. A figure rose broad shoulders, a steady gait despite a limp. Derek Lawson, a veteran who had once worn the uniform overseas, now wore plain travel clothes. His voice carried without needing volume. "That's enough." Every head turned. Derek stepped into the aisle, his gaze fixed on Charles. "You don't lay a hand on a child. Not ever." The tension thickened, pressing against the walls of the cabin. Passengers held their breath, waiting to see what would unfold at 35,000 feet above the ground. The aisle felt narrower as Derek Lawson stepped forward, his presence filling the space like a wall of quiet certainty. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Years of military service had carved authority into his tone, into the way he carried himself. His limp, the subtle drag of his right leg, spoke of sacrifice, not weakness. Charles Denton scoffed, leaning back in his seat with a smug grin. "Mind your business," he muttered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His voice carried the dismissive weight of someone who'd spent a lifetime unchecked. "This doesn't concern you." But it did. Every eye in the cabin said so. A child had been struck. A line had been crossed. Derek's gaze didn't waver. "You struck a boy," he said evenly, "and now it concerns all of us." The flight attendants shifted uneasily. One, a young woman named Kelly, took a tentative step forward. Her voice trembled with corporate politeness. "Gentlemen, please, let's de-escalate. We want everyone to remain calm." But calm had already been shattered. Malcolm Rivers tightened his arm around Isaiah, who clung to his father's sweater. He wanted to shield his son from every eye, every whisper, every ugly assumption that had filled the space the moment Charles lashed out. Inside Malcolm, a storm raged. Years of restraint, of measured words in hostile boardrooms, of knowing how quickly black men were painted as aggressors, held him in place. His silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. But silence cut deep when his son's wide eyes begged for reassurance. Derek sensed it. He looked at Malcolm, giving a small nod, a silent promise. "You're not alone." Charles laughed, loud enough for Rose to hear. "What's this? Some kind of brotherhood?" He sneered. "You people are all the same, overreacting, playing victim." He brushed my seat. "That's all." Maybe if his father taught him respect. The words hung, dripping venom. Several passengers gasped. A man across the aisle muttered, "Unbelievable." A woman pulled out her phone, fingers trembling as she hit record. Malcolm's jaw flexed. He inhaled slowly, speaking at last, his voice low but firm. "Respect is earned, not beaten into children." For the first time, Charles's smirk faltered. Malcolm's tone wasn't loud, yet it carried a gravity that silenced even the chuckles from the businessmen who'd laughed minutes earlier. Isaiah's small fingers clutched tighter at his father's sleeve. He whispered so softly, only Malcolm could hear Daddy. "I'm scared." Malcolm kissed the crown of his son's head. "I know, son, but you're safe." The words steadied him as much as they steadied the boy. Derek took another step forward, planting himself between Charles and the rest of the cabin. "You will apologize to the boy," he said. "No theatrics. Just fact." Charles scoffed, his bravado rising again. "Or what, you'll limp over here and make me for a heartbeat?" The plane seemed to hold its breath. Then Derek leaned down, his face level with Charles's. His voice dropped to a quiet register, meant only for the man in the suit, but the stillness carried it further. "I've stood in places where real men fight. Denton, you wouldn't last a day." The smirk collapsed. Charles's eyes flickered, just for a second, with something that looked like recognition of danger. Not physical danger, but moral. He was being measured against a man whose scars were earned in service, not bought with money. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure where to stand. Others straightened, emboldened. A businessman in row 5 whispered to his colleague, "He's right. The guy slapped a kid." The flight attendants, caught in the crossfire of duty and conscience, hesitated. Kelly's hand hovered near the intercom, but her eyes betrayed sympathy as she glanced at Isaiah's tear-streaked face. Finally, Charles waved a dismissive hand, muttering, "Fine, whatever." His voice dripped insincerity. He turned toward Isaiah, but the words that came out were no apology. "Keep your hands to yourself next time, boy." The cabin bristled. Malcolm's spine stiffened. But before he could speak, Derek's voice cut through once more. "That's not an apology." Charles's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked trapped. Passengers' phones hovered, recording, the weight of eyes, of potential headlines, pressed in. He muttered through clenched teeth. Sorry, it was hollow, brittle, meaningless, but it was spoken. Malcolm leaned close to Isaiah. "Hear that? Son. That's a man who doesn't understand real respect. But you will." The boy nodded, his cheeks still red, but his father's calm steadiness anchored him. The rest of the flight dragged intense silence. Flight attendants offered refills, but conversations were hushed, eyes darting between Charles's stiff posture and the quiet strength of Malcolm and Derek. As the plane cruised above the Midwest, Malcolm stared at the darkness beyond the window. Inside, his thoughts tangled. He replayed Isaiah's question. Did I do something wrong again and again? It gnawed at him, heavier than any insult. Because the truth was cruel, his son had done nothing wrong. Yet the world would often tell him otherwise. Malcolm's chest tightened with memory. His own father, pulled over without cause when Malcolm was Isaiah's age. The officer's hand resting too casually on his holster. The sting of knowing his father's dignity was chipped away by silence. He swore Isaiah would never feel alone in that same way. Hours later, as the cabin dimmed and passengers dozed, Derek quietly slid into the empty seat across from Malcolm. He leaned forward, voice low. "You did right by staying calm." Malcolm met his eyes, weary but resolute. "Staying calm doesn't always feel right." Derek nodded. "I know, but the world is waiting for any excuse to twist the story. You gave them none." Malcolm studied the man. A stranger, yet not. There was recognition in the way they carried silence. Both had been tested in ways others in this cabin could never understand. "Thank you," Malcolm said simply. Derek shrugged, eyes softening. "I didn't do it for thanks. Some lines you don't let anyone cross, not when a kid's involved." Isaiah stirred in his sleep, shifting closer to his father. Malcolm placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. The boy sighed and settled again. Outside, the stars scattered endless across the sky. Inside, the plane hummed forward, carrying with it the weight of what had already happened, and the heavier weight of what was yet to come, because this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a storm none of them could yet see. When the plane touched down in Chicago, the tension inside the cabin hadn't eased. If anything, it had thickened, as if the recycled air itself carried the residues of Charles Denton's arrogance and the unspoken fears of those who had witnessed it. Passengers shifted impatiently, desperate to leave, but wary of what might happen once the doors opened. Malcolm Rivers sat stiffly, his arm protectively draped around Isaiah, who was finally dozing against his chest. The boy's breathing was shallow, uneven, his nervous system reacting to stress the way it always had, fragile from the condition that shadowed his childhood. Malcolm stroked his son's back slowly, steadying his own pulse as much as the boy's. Derek Lawson had stayed close. He hadn't said much after that final confrontation, but his presence was a steady anchor. Passengers who earlier avoided eye contact now glanced at him with quiet respect, though few dared to speak. They had all witnessed a line being drawn, and most weren't sure where they themselves had stood until the stranger stood up. When the fasten seatbelt sign blinked off, the cabin erupted into the usual shuffle of bags and jackets. But the flight attendants' voices were tight, forced. Kelly, the young attendant who had tried to intervene earlier, approached Malcolm with hesitation. "Mr. Rivers," she said quietly. "There's going to be airport security at the gate. They'll want statements." Malcolm's stomach clenched. Of course there would be. But he had seen this pattern before when black men defended themselves. The story shifted, the blame reshaped. He leaned down and whispered to Isaiah, "Stay close to me. Son, don't let go of my hand." At the front of the cabin, Charles straightened his suit jacket, already rehearsing his performance. He looked more annoyed than nervous, muttering to himself about lawsuits and disrespect. Two men in business attire, who had been silent seatmates during the flight, patted him on the shoulder as though reassuring a friend at a cocktail party, not a man who had just slapped a child. When the doors opened, the cool blast of jet bridge air felt like a reprieve. But waiting beyond was no relief. Two TSA officers, an airport security supervisor, and a representative from the airline stood in a small cluster, radios buzzing at their waists. Behind them, the curious eyes of other disembarking passengers tracked every movement. Charles was first to step off, chest puffed with the confidence of someone certain he could bend systems to his will. He immediately launched into his version of events, his voice rising with feigned indignation. The boy was disruptive, unsafe. I acted to protect passengers, not harm him. These people are exaggerating. Malcolm held Isaiah closer as they stepped into the circle of officials. Isaiah stirred, his face pale, eyes darting nervously between the adults towering over him. "Sir," the supervisor said, addressing Malcolm first, "we need to understand what happened on board." Before Malcolm could respond, Charles cut in. "He's lying if he says I hit the boy. Everyone knows how these things get blown up." His sneer carried the same entitlement he had flaunted in the air. Derek's voice cut through, steady as stone. "I saw him slap the child. Others did too. You've got passengers recording it." He gestured toward a woman still clutching her phone nervously, as though the device itself might be confiscated. The supervisor hesitated, looking from Malcolm to Charles to Derek. It was the hesitation Malcolm feared most, that split second, when bias might tilt the scales. He steadied his breath, speaking with the same calm he had honed in countless hostile boardrooms. "My son touched the back of Mr. Denton's seat. In response, Mr. Denton turned and struck him. He did so in full view of this cabin. Malcolm's voice didn't waver, but his hand on Isaiah's shoulder trembled slightly. There is nothing disruptive about an 8-year-old brushing a seat. Charles laughed, sharp and cruel. You're twisting it. That boy needs discipline. The words drew murmurs from the crowd now spilling into the gate area. Some voices whispered support for Malcolm. Others muttered skepticism. It was the court of public opinion forming in real time, unpredictable and volatile. Then, from the back of the group, a voice rose shaky but clear. I saw it too. He hit the boy. It was Kelly, the flight attendant. She stepped forward, her airline badge catching the fluorescent light. Mr. Denton struck the child. We're trained to manage disruptions. But there was no disruption, just cruelty. The silence that followed was heavy. Charles's smirk faltered. The supervisor nodded slowly, turning toward the officers. We'll need to file an incident report. Both parties will give statements. Malcolm exhaled, relief mingling with exhaustion. But the battle was far from over. He could see it in Charles's eyes. This wasn't a man who accepted accountability. This was a man who would summon lawyers, who would twist narratives, who had likely walked away from worse. Hours later, after forms were signed and statements recorded, Malcolm finally carried Isaiah out of the terminal. The boy had fallen asleep against his shoulder, drained from the ordeal. Derek walked beside them, silent but steady, until they reached the taxi stand. You've got a storm coming, Derek said finally, his gaze fixed on the horizon. That man, he won't let this die quiet. Malcolm nodded. He knew it already. He had felt it in Charles's gaze, in the way he spit words like weapons. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the spark of something larger. Thank you, Malcolm said again, his voice low, tired but sincere. Derek shook his head. Just promise me one thing. Don't let him make your boy believe this is his fault. His voice cracked slightly, betraying a memory he didn't share. The world will try. Don't let them. Malcolm swallowed hard, the weight of those words pressing into his chest. He opened the taxi door, settling Isaiah carefully inside. When he turned back, Derek was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd with the quiet dignity of a man who didn't need recognition. As the cab pulled away from O'Hare, Malcolm stared at the sleeping boy beside him. His mind churned not with defeat, but with determination. He knew Charles Denton's reach would extend far beyond that flight. There would be headlines, accusations, threats. But Malcolm also knew this the world had seen. Witnesses had spoken, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the possibility of a fight worth waging. The cab rolled through the wet Chicago streets, wipers beating against a sudden spring storm. Malcolm Rivers sat in silence, his son's head resting against his arm. Isaiah had not stirred since they left the airport, but his small hand still clutched Malcolm's shirt, even in sleep. It was the grip of a boy afraid the world might take his father away if he let go. Malcolm's phone buzzed. He pulled it out reluctantly, not wanting to disturb Isaiah. On the screen were dozens of missed calls, notifications, and a flood of emails. The incident was already spreading. Videos posted by passengers were climbing into thousands of views. Some captions demanded justice for Isaiah. Others twisted the story, parroting Charles Denton's claims that the boy had been disruptive and Malcolm aggressive. The narrative war had begun, faster than Malcolm anticipated. By the time the taxi pulled up to his townhouse, Reporters were already outside. A cluster of cameras, umbrellas, and shouting voices swarmed the steps. "Mr. Rivers, did you provoke the altercation? Is this about money? Will you press charges?" Malcolm clenched his jaw. He shifted Isaiah carefully, shielding his son's face as he exited the cab. Flashes popped like lightning. The boy stirred, whimpering. Malcolm ignored the barrage of questions, pushing through the crowd until the door shut behind him. Only then did he exhale, sinking into the silence of his home. He carried Isaiah upstairs, tucked him into bed, and sat at the edge until the boy's breathing settled into the rhythm of deep sleep. In the dim light, Malcolm's chest ached. He wanted to collapse beside his son, to let exhaustion pull him under. But his phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID was one he recognized, Camille Hayes. He answered on the second ring. "Malcolm." Camille's voice was brisk, clipped with urgency. "I've already seen the footage. It's everywhere." "I know," Malcolm said quietly. "We just got home. Isaiah's asleep." Camille's tone softened slightly. "Good. Keep him close. But listen, Charles Denton isn't going to let this end with public outrage. He has lawyers, media contacts, politicians in his pocket. I've gone up against men like him before. He'll twist everything until people believe you're the aggressor." Malcolm rubbed his temple, the familiar fatigue of corporate battles creeping in. "So what do? We prepare," Camille replied, "and we move fast. By morning, his PR team will have statements out. By tomorrow night, talking heads on television will be calling you unstable, maybe unfit as a parent. We're not just fighting for your reputation. We're fighting for Isaiah's safety." Malcolm closed his eyes. He could almost feel the weight pressing down decades of history. Every unspoken rule that told him black men had to be twice as calm, twice as composed. And even then, it might not be enough. "I won't let him take my son," Malcolm whispered. "You won't," Camille assured him. "But you can't fight this alone. I'll be at your place first thing in the morning. Until then, stay inside. Don't give them any footage they can twist." When the call ended, Malcolm lingered at Isaiah's bedside. He thought of Derek Lawson, the stranger who had stood up without hesitation. He thought of Kelly, the young flight attendant who had risked her job to tell the truth. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he feared. But as dawn broke, the retaliation came. The first blow arrived in the form of a news segment, a polished anchor, voice dripping with practiced neutrality. Introduced Charles Denton as a respected philanthropist and real estate leader. Clips of him cutting ribbons and shaking hands with politicians played on screen. Then came Denton's statement, filmed in his marble foyer. "This incident has been distorted," Denton declared smoothly. "I acted in the best interest of passenger safety. Any claim otherwise is a malicious attempt to tarnish my reputation. My heart goes out to the child, but the truth will prevail." The segment ended with a panel of commentators, two of whom echoed Denton's narrative that this was an unfortunate misunderstanding being exploited by activist agendas. Malcolm watched with tightening fists. The erasure of truth had already begun. The second blow came later that afternoon. An unmarked envelope arrived at his door. Inside was a grainy photo of Malcolm leaving a late-night boardroom 3 years ago, taken at an angle that made him look disheveled, weary. The accompanying note read, "We know who you really are." Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, the photo trembling in his hands. He knew the tactic. Denton's private investigators were digging, searching for anything, any shred of imperfection to weaponize. It wasn't just intimidation. It was a message. We can reach you anywhere. The third blow was the hardest. When Malcolm went to check on Isaiah, the boy was sitting upright in bed, tablet in his lap. His eyes were wide, wet. On the screen was a video from a cable channel. A commentator sneered, "This is what happens when entitlement goes unchecked. Some parents think their kids can do no wrong." "Daddy," Isaiah whispered, "did I do something bad?" Malcolm's chest broke. He sat beside his son, pulling the boy gently into his arms. "No, son, you did nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing. But they're saying," Isaiah's voice cracked, "they're saying you and me, we're the bad ones." Malcolm held him tighter, fighting the lump in his throat. "They're wrong. Sometimes people with power lie to protect themselves, but lies don't last forever." Isaiah buried his face in his father's chest. Malcolm closed his eyes, willing himself not to cry, not to let his son feel the weight of his despair. Later that night, after Isaiah finally drifted to sleep, Malcolm sat in his office. Camille's words echoed in his mind. "You can't fight this alone." His gaze fell on a scrap of paper where he'd scrawled Derek Lawson's name. The stranger had vanished into the airport crowd, but something about his steady presence lingered. Perhaps he was more than just a momentary ally. Malcolm picked up his phone. After a pause, he began drafting a message to Camille Find Lawson. "I think we'll need him." By the time Camille Hayes arrived the next morning, Malcolm Rivers had been awake for hours. His townhouse was still. The only sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant rattle of rain against the windows. Isaiah was curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching an old cartoon with half-lidded eyes. His smile was faint, distracted. Even in rest, he carried the weight of something a child should never have to bear. Camille stepped inside briskly, her umbrella dripping on the doormat. "It's worse than we thought," she said without preamble. "Denton's team has flooded the media. He's already framing himself as the victim of a smear campaign." Malcolm poured coffee into 2 mugs and set one in front of her. "He's good at it. He's had practice." Camille's dark eyes narrowed. "Yes, and if we don't counter fast, he'll control the narrative entirely." She spread out a folder on the table. Inside were printouts of articles, screenshots of social media posts, and statements from Denton's allies. "He's weaponized half the local press already. But look here." She pointed to a trending hashtag, Arat Justice for Isaiah. Thousands of comments had flooded in overnight. Parents, teachers, strangers furious that a child had been struck. Malcolm studied the posts. One photo of Isaiah, snapped by a sympathetic passenger as they left the gate, had already gone viral. In it, Isaiah clutched his father's hand, his face pale, eyes downcast. The caption read, "No child should fear flying because of the color of his skin." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "So the public isn't all on his side." "No," Camille said, "and that's our opening. But to use it, we need credibility, witnesses, people Denton can't easily discredit." Malcolm thought immediately of Derek Lawson, the veteran whose quiet authority had pierced Denton's arrogance mid-flight. He had vanished into the airport crowd, but Malcolm felt certain he wasn't gone. "Find Lawson," he said. "We need him." Camille nodded. "I've already started. My investigator's combing TSA records from O'Hare. Veterans aren't easy to track if they don't want to be. But Lawson didn't seem the type to hide." At that moment, Isaiah looked up from the couch. His voice was small, but steady. "Daddy, are we going to beat the bad man?" The question pierced Malcolm. He crouched beside his son, brushing a hand over his hair. "We're going to stand up to him, Isaiah, and we're not alone." The boy nodded slowly, as if trying to believe it. Camille watched silently, her jaw tightening. She knew the stakes were larger than one family. If Denton succeeded in burying the truth, it would send a message far beyond Chicago that even in the face of overwhelming evidence, wealth and privilege could erase harm. By afternoon, Camille had arranged a meeting at a modest office downtown with allies from advocacy groups, civil rights lawyers, community organizers, even a retired judge known for his outspoken criticism of systemic bias. Malcolm hesitated at the doorway, Isaiah's hand clasped tightly in his own. He was used to corporate boardrooms lined with suits and polished wood, not cluttered spaces filled with handwritten posters and the hum of second-hand computers. But as he entered, conversations quieted. Every eye turned toward him, not with suspicion, but with expectation. "This is Mr. Rivers," Camille introduced, "and this is his son, Isaiah." The room rose slightly in acknowledgement. A woman with silver braids stepped forward. "We've seen the footage," she said warmly. "We've seen the truth. You're not alone anymore." Malcolm swallowed hard. He had spent years cultivating composure, learning never to show cracks in public. But here, surrounded by strangers who seemed ready to stand beside him, he felt something shift. He felt less alone. They spent hours strategizing. The group agreed to coordinate media outreach, amplifying Joe's justice for Isaiah, with verified statements from passengers who had already spoken privately. A pediatric specialist offered to review Isaiah's medical records, ensuring Denton couldn't distort his condition as behavioral issues. But the most significant contribution came when a young woman in the corner raised her hand. Her name was Sarah Lopez, a former employee of Denton's real estate company. Her voice trembled as she spoke. He covered up things before. Discrimination, harassment. We were told to keep quiet. But if others are speaking out, maybe I can too." Camille leaned forward sharply. "If you're willing, your testimony could expose a pattern. Denton thrives because every incident seems isolated. But if we show it's not—" Sarah nodded, her eyes flicking nervously toward Malcolm. "I don't want anyone else to go through what your son went through." Malcolm met her gaze, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said softly. When they finally left the office, evening shadows stretched long across the streets. Malcolm carried Isaiah, who had fallen asleep again, his small head heavy against his father's shoulder. Camille walked beside him, her bag stuffed with new affidavits, contacts, and promises of support. But as they approached Malcolm's townhouse, a black SUV idled at the curb. Its windows were tinted, the engine humming softly. Malcolm froze. He recognized the vehicle instantly. He had seen the same model, the same subtle detail of custom rims, parked outside the courthouse during a previous murder case where Denton had flexed his presence like a threat. The SUV pulled away slowly as they approached, but the message was clear. Denton knew where they lived. Denton was watching. That night, Malcolm sat at his desk long after Isaiah had gone to bed. Rain tapped against the window. Camille had insisted on staying, claiming the couch as her temporary headquarters. Her determination was unshakable, but Malcolm's own mind was restless. He thought of his son's question, "Are we going to beat the bad man?" and the weight of his answer. He thought of Derek Lawson, a stranger who had become a symbol of courage in a single moment. And he thought of Charles Denton, whose reach seemed endless, whose arrogance had already begun to twist the truth in ways that threatened everything Malcolm held dear. Malcolm knew the fight had only begun. But as he looked down at Isaiah's tablet, still glowing faintly with messages of support under the hashtag #Justice for Isaiah, He felt something stir that had been dormant for too long. Hope. The morning after the SUV appeared outside his townhouse, Malcolm Rivers woke to the sound of knuckles rapping against the front door. It wasn't the hurried knock of a neighbor, nor the friendly rhythm of a delivery driver. This one was steady, deliberate, the kind that carried weight before words were even spoken. Camille Hayes was already in the kitchen, a half-empty cup of coffee steaming in her hands. She stiffened when she heard it. Malcolm put a finger to his lips, gesturing for silence as he moved down the hallway. Through the peephole, he saw two people, both in gray suits, both carrying thin black folders. Their posture screamed official. The taller one, a man with slicked back hair, lifted a badge against the glass Department of Family Services. Malcolm's chest tightened. He opened the door slowly. "Can I help you?" The man spoke with a rehearsed tone, each word clipped. "Mr. Rivers." "I'm Investigator Calloway. This is Ms. Jensen. We've received a report of potential instability in your home environment. We'll need to speak with you and your son." Behind Malcolm, footsteps pattered on the stairs. Isaiah stood in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. His small voice floated down. "Daddy, who's here?" Malcolm's hand flexed against the doorframe. "My son's not answering any questions," he said evenly. "Not without my attorney." Camille appeared at his side, already pulling a card from her bag. "I'm Ms. Hayes, legal counsel. If you have questions, they go through me." The investigators exchanged glances. "Ms." Jensen smiled thinly. "Of course. But you understand we have authority to conduct wellness checks. This is standard procedure." Camille's eyes narrowed. Standard procedure doesn't usually begin 24 hours after a high-profile incident involving one of Chicago's wealthiest developers. Let's not insult each other with pretense. Isaiah shifted uncomfortably, clutching the banister. Malcolm moved toward him, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Go back upstairs, son. It's all right." The boy hesitated, his eyes wide, but obeyed. When his footsteps faded, Malcolm turned back to the investigators. His voice was calm, but iron lined every syllable. "You can make your notes. You can file your reports. But know this, I will not be intimidated out of protecting my son." The two agents scribbled briefly in their folders, then retreated with polite smiles that never touched their eyes. As the door clicked shut, Malcolm sagged against it. Camille placed a hand on his arm. "This is Denton. He's pulling strings." "I know," Malcolm said, his jaw tight, "and he's just getting started." Later that day, the first signs of damage appeared. Isaiah's school called, claiming concerns about attendance and requesting a meeting to ensure the child's stability. Malcolm heard the coded language beneath the words. He'd spent his life deciphering it. Stability meant credibility. It meant the question of whether a black father was fit to raise his own son. By evening, Isaiah's pediatrician called to cancel an upcoming appointment, citing insurance complications. Malcolm's throat burned as he listened. His company provided platinum-tier insurance. Complications meant pressure, meant someone higher up pulling levers to make care inaccessible. Isaiah, sensing the tension in his father's movements, grew quieter. He clung closer at bedtime, refusing to let go of Malcolm's hand until sleep finally pulled him under. Malcolm lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, replaying every choice that had led them here. He had built a life to shield his son from the storms he himself had endured as a child. Yet here they were, storms knocking at their door again. Camille stayed late, drafting motions, lining up affidavits, preparing for the next inevitable strike. "He's trying to isolate you," she said. her voice rough with fatigue. If the system paints you as unstable, if Isaiah looks distressed in public, Denton will argue for custody interference. We have to stay ahead of him. Malcolm pinched the bridge of his nose. He's not just targeting me. He's targeting my son's sense of safety. That's worse. Camille looked at him carefully. Then we fight on two fronts legally and emotionally. He wants Isaiah to feel broken. Don't let him. Malcolm nodded, though his insides twisted with doubt. He thought of Derek Lawson, the stranger whose steady courage still lingered in his memory. He thought of Sarah Lopez, the former employee ready to testify. Allies existed. The circle was widening, but the walls were closing in just as quickly. That night, as rain lashed harder against the windows, Malcolm sat in his office scrolling through messages. One caught his eye, an anonymous email sent from an encrypted address. The subject line read, "He's not untouchable." Curiosity prickled. Malcolm opened it cautiously. Inside were scanned documents, financial records, internal memos, property transfers. At the bottom, a note. More where this came from. You don't know me yet, but I know Denton. He's built on rot, and rot always leaks. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in his tired eyes. He didn't know if this was bait or blessing, but one thing was clear: cracks were forming in Denton's empire. He glanced toward the stairs where Isaiah slept. For the first time in days, he felt something spark beneath the exhaustion. Not just hope. Resolve. 2 weeks later, Malcolm Rivers sat in a quiet conference room at the Cook County Courthouse. His suit pressed, but his eyes rimmed with fatigue. Camille Hayes stood beside him, flipping through a stack of documents with the speed of someone who had lived too many battles in too few years. Isaiah was not present. Malcolm had arranged for a trusted neighbor to watch him that morning. He wanted to spare his son the sight of marble columns and harsh fluorescent lights, spaces that too often swallowed the voices of people who looked like them. The summons had arrived late the previous night, an emergency hearing to evaluate concerns of parental stability. It was a move straight from Charles Denton's playbook Blindside Tactics, designed to rob opponents of preparation. Camille had warned him this might happen. Still, the swiftness of it left Malcolm's stomach knotted. At 10 sharp, the bailiff's voice called the case. They entered the courtroom. Judge Alcott, a woman with sharp glasses and an expression honed by years of parsing lies, presided from the bench. To Malcolm's left sat the state's representatives, Investigator Calloway and Ms. Jensen. Their folders were thick. Their expressions practiced neutrality. And then, at the far side of the room, Charles Denton entered with his lawyers. He looked polished, confident, his silk tie gleaming beneath the lights. He caught Malcolm's eye for the briefest second and allowed the corner of his mouth to curl into a smirk. It was the kind of smirk that said, "I set the stage. You're just playing on it." The hearing began with procedural recitations, but soon the real knives came out. Calloway stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, our department has received multiple reports questioning the stability of Mr. Rivers's home environment. We have concerns regarding the child's emotional welfare, particularly in the wake of recent events that have garnered significant public attention." Camille was on her feet instantly. "Your Honor, these so-called reports are suspiciously timed, surfacing only after Mr. Rivers's son was assaulted by Mr. Denton on a commercial flight. We intend to show this as retaliation, not genuine concern." "Ms." Jensen countered smoothly. "The department acts on the information it receives. Ms. Hayes, it is not our role to weigh motives, only to protect children." Then came the so-called evidence photographs of Isaiah looking pale at school. Notes from teachers worried about his withdrawn demeanor. Medical appointment cancellations cited as neglect. Malcolm's fists clenched beneath the table. Each fragment was twisted, stripped of context, turned into a weapon. When it was Camille's turn, she moved like a seasoned fencer, precise, deliberate. Your Honor, Isaiah suffers from a documented neurological condition. Stress can exacerbate symptoms. The child's withdrawn state is a result of trauma directly caused by being struck by Mr. Denton, not parental neglect. We will provide medical records and expert testimony to this effect. She pivoted sharply toward Calloway. Did your office review the airline footage? Calloway shifted uncomfortably. We are aware of media reports, but did you review the footage Camille pressed? No, he admitted. Then you are presenting conclusions without the most crucial piece of evidence. Camille's voice cut through the room like glass. That alone should discredit this ambush. Judge Alcott raised a hand. Enough. I'll not have this descend into theatrics. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Mr. Rivers, stand. Malcolm rose, his palms damp, his throat tight. Do you have anything to say for yourself as a father? The judge asked. For a moment, the room blurred. Malcolm saw not the polished wood of the bench, but Isaiah's face. That night in bed, when he whispered, Daddy, did I do something wrong? He felt the sting of the question all over again. He inhaled slowly. Yes, Your Honor, I have something to say. The courtroom hushed. My son is 8 years old. He is bright, kind, and fragile in ways I wish he didn't have to be. He has endured something no child should endure. And instead of support, he has been met with suspicion. Not because of what he did, but because of who he is, because of who I am. I have spent my entire life walking a line, controlling my tone, my words, my expression, because one slip could cost me everything. And now, despite all that, despite every effort to build a safe life for my son, we are here. Not because I failed him, but because a powerful man believes he can rewrite the truth. I will not let him. Isaiah is my son, his safety, his joy, his dignity. They are non-negotiable. That is all I have to say. Silence. Even Denton's smirk faltered. Judge Alcott studied Malcolm for a long moment, then turned her gaze to Camille. I want those medical records and affidavits on my desk within 48 hours. Until then, custody remains with Mr. Rivers. But let me be clear, if evidence emerges that this child is at risk, I will act. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Outside the courtroom, Malcolm exhaled shakily. Camille touched his arm. You did well. She's not blind. Malcolm, she saw the truth. But Malcolm's relief was tempered. Saw it today, tomorrow. Who knows? He looked across the marble hallway, where Denton and his lawyers strode away, their voices low and confident. They looked like men already plotting their next move. As they left the courthouse, Malcolm's phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. He answered cautiously. A woman's voice spoke, quiet but urgent. Mr. Rivers, my name is Elena Denton. I think it's time we talked. The call from Elena Denton replayed in Malcolm Rivers's mind all the way home from the courthouse. Her voice had carried both urgency and something else, weariness, perhaps, or guilt. Camille Hayes had raised an eyebrow when she heard the name. Elena Denton. Charles's ex-wife, she asked. Malcolm had only nodded, too drained to unpack the implications. That conversation would have to wait, because when they returned home, something far more pressing awaited. Isaiah was pale, his forehead damp with sweat. His neighbor, who had been watching him, looked worried. "He had another episode," she whispered. "Not a full seizure, but close. You should call his doctor." Malcolm scooped his son into his arms. The boy's small body felt lighter than it should, his head resting limply against his father's shoulder. "It's okay, son. Daddy's got you." The night became a blur of flashing ambulance lights, the sting of antiseptic, and the hollow echo of hospital hallways. Isaiah was rushed into the ICU, doctors moving around him with practiced urgency. Malcolm followed, his chest tight with fear, every step weighted by the helplessness of a parent watching machines take over where love could not. Hours passed. Malcolm sat in a stiff chair by the bed, his hand wrapped around Isaiah's. The boy's face looked too still beneath the tangle of wires and tubes. Each beep from the monitor carved another mark into Malcolm's chest. Camille stayed nearby, making calls, intercepting nurses who tried to ask questions about insurance. But when the chaos settled into the slow rhythm of hospital life, she sat down beside Malcolm. "You need to rest," she said softly. Malcolm shook his head. "He needs me awake." Her gaze softened. "And what about you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stared at Isaiah and let the silence stretch. Inside, his thoughts were a storm. He replayed the slap on the plane, the courtroom ambush, the investigators at his door. Each memory tangled with another. His father pulled over for no reason. His mother's whispered prayers at night. The countless times he had been told to lower his voice, soften his tone, make himself smaller so he wouldn't be seen as a threat. Now his son was lying in an ICU bed, not because of some random tragedy, but because a powerful man had decided to target them. The injustice pressed down so hard Malcolm felt his chest might crack. At some point, he must have dozed in the chair, because he woke to a small voice. Daddy Isaiah's eyes were half open, unfocused but searching. Malcolm leaned close, tears prickling. "I'm here, son. I'm right here." "Did I do something wrong again?" Isaiah whispered. The words shattered him. Malcolm bent low, resting his forehead gently against his son's. "No, Isaiah, never. You did nothing wrong. This is not your fault. Not now. Not ever." Isaiah blinked slowly, then slipped back into a medicated sleep. Malcolm sat there, unmoving, as tears finally spilled. He wept silently, careful not to wake his son, each tear carrying years of restrained fury and grief. Later, when the hallway was quiet, Camille found him still at the bedside. "We need to think carefully," she said. "Denton won't stop. He'll use Isaiah's health against you if he can." Malcolm's hands clenched around his son's small fingers. "Then we don't give him the chance." Camille studied him for a long moment. "You're thinking of giving up the fight." He met her eyes, exhausted. If stepping back means Denton leaves Isaiah alone, maybe. He trailed off, the thought choking him. The idea of surrender was poison, but so was the thought of his child enduring more pain. Camille leaned forward, her voice fierce. "Listen to me. That's exactly what Denton wants. He doesn't care about Isaiah's well-being. He cares about breaking you. If you give up now, Isaiah grows up believing his father couldn't protect him. Do you want that?" Malcolm closed his eyes. The war inside him raged louder than any courtroom battle. Fear told him to retreat, to shield Isaiah from further blows. But love, the deeper, fiercer kind, told him to stand taller, to fight harder. He inhaled shakily. "No, I won't let him win." The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds. Isaiah was more alert, sipping water through a straw, his eyes heavy but calmer. Malcolm felt a sliver of relief. And then his phone buzzed again, another anonymous email. This time, the subject line read, "He's losing control." Attached was an audio file. Malcolm pressed play, and Denton's voice filled the tiny hospital room. "Make sure the boy's caseworker keeps the pressure on. If Rivers cracks, we own him. I don't care what it costs." Malcolm's blood ran cold. This wasn't just intimidation. It was conspiracy, recorded and traceable. Camille's eyes lit with sharp determination. This is evidence, solid evidence. Whoever sent this, they're inside Denton's circle. We can use this to open a wider case. Malcolm nodded slowly, his gaze returning to Isaiah. For the first time in days, his fear didn't feel like a chain. It felt like fuel. If Denton wanted a war, then Malcolm would fight it with everything he had, not just for himself, but for the boy whose small hand was still wrapped around his. Malcolm Rivers stood outside the hospital in the pale afternoon light, the audio file still replaying in his mind. Denton's voice, arrogant and careless, was the crack they had been waiting for. Camille Hayes had already forwarded it to a trusted contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office. But Malcolm knew better than to assume that one piece of evidence would topple a man who had spent decades weaving himself into the city's power structures. As he lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text, not anonymous, but from a blocked number. "Meet me. No press, no lawyers. Just you. 6 p.m. Maison Laurier, private dining room." The signature chilled him. E.D. Elena Denton. Malcolm muttered under his breath. He hesitated, torn between suspicion and curiosity. If Charles's ex-wife really wanted to talk, she might hold the kind of information money and influence couldn't bury. But it could also be a trap. Back inside the hospital, Camille noticed the faraway look in his eyes. "What is it?" He showed her the message. She frowned. "It could be bait. Denton's people might be setting you up. Or it could be the leverage we need," Malcolm replied. "If she's willing to turn on him, that changes everything." Camille crossed her arms. "Then you're not going alone. If you walk into that restaurant without backup, you're giving Denton an opportunity to bury you in more ways than one." By evening, Malcolm arrived at Maison Laurier. The restaurant's glass doors reflected the last streaks of sunset. He was ushered by a discreet maître d' into a small, candlelit room where Elena Denton sat waiting. She looked immaculate, cream-colored suit, pearls that caught the low light, but her eyes betrayed a mix of nerves and resolve. "Mr. Rivers," she said softly as he entered. "Thank you for coming." Malcolm took the seat across from her, wary but composed. "You asked for no lawyers. That makes me cautious." "I understand," Elena replied. "But if we are to speak honestly, it must be without intermediaries. Charles has eyes everywhere. Even your attorney, brilliant as she is, cannot guarantee her lines aren't tapped." The waiter poured water and withdrew, leaving them in silence. Elena slid a small flash drive across the table. Malcolm didn't touch it yet. "What's on it?" he asked. "Evidence? Financial records? Emails? Notes from his private doctor. Charles isn't invincible. He has weaknesses. You'll find them there." Malcolm studied her carefully. "Why now?" For the first time, her composure cracked. She looked down, twisting her wedding band finger, though no ring was there. "Because I should have spoken years ago. During our divorce, I took the settlement and signed his NDA. I told myself the money would help my foundation, that staying silent was pragmatic, but it was cowardice. And now he's targeting your child." Her voice shook, but her gaze rose, steady and unflinching. "I will not let another boy suffer because I chose comfort over conscience. Malcolm finally reached for the flash drive, feeling its weight like a stone in his palm. If what you're saying is true, this could destroy him. It can, Elena said, leaning closer. But you must be careful. Charles has built his empire on fear. Judges, hospital administrators, politicians, they all owe him. If you release everything at once, it gets buried. Use it piece by piece. Apply pressure where he least expects it. Make the cracks widen until he has nowhere left to stand. Malcolm nodded slowly. And what happens to you? Her smile was brittle. I've moved assets into trusts under my daughter's name. He'll try to ruin me. Yes, but my silence has already ruined me once. This time, I'll live with the consequences. Before Malcolm could respond, his phone buzzed. Camille's text hospital just called. New doctor assigned to Isaiah's case. They want you there immediately. His pulse spiked. He stood abruptly. I have to go. Elena reached for his hand briefly. One more thing. Charles is paranoid. He sweeps for bugs, changes phones weekly, but he trusts his personal driver. The man's been with him 15 years. If you need to know where he's going, start there. Malcolm left the restaurant with the flash drive burning a hole in his pocket, his thoughts racing. Back at the hospital, Camille was waiting near the nurses' station, visibly agitated. They reassigned Isaiah's attending physician without explanation, and the new one immediately proposed altering his medication again. I stalled. But we need to act. Malcolm's jaw tightened. We have evidence of Denton's influence. We use it now. Together. They entered Isaiah's room. The boy stirred weakly, his face pale but conscious. Daddy, he whispered, his voice thin. Don't let them give me the foggy medicine again. Malcolm knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. I won't, son. I promise. That night, while Camille prepared an emergency filing to block any further changes to Isaiah's care, Malcolm locked himself in the hospital's family lounge with his laptop. He plugged in the flash drive. What he saw confirmed Elena's words: years of concealed incidents, financial bribes, medical cover-ups, and a chilling pattern of silencing victims. But one document stood out: a psychiatric evaluation diagnosing Charles Denton with narcissistic personality disorder and explosive anger issues. The report had been buried, its doctor quietly bought out. Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time, he saw the man who had tormented them not as untouchable, but as fragile. Dangerous, yes, but not invincible. He returned to Isaiah's bedside near dawn. The boy slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Malcolm stroked his son's hand gently, whispering to himself more than anyone else, "This ends. Not tomorrow. Not someday." Now, the next morning, Camille entered the room, her eyes alight. The judge granted our motion. Any changes to Isaiah's care now require oversight from an independent ethics committee. That buys us time. Malcolm looked down at his son, then back at her. Time's all I need, because I'm done playing defense. It's time to bring the fight to him. By the third morning in the ICU, the tension around the hospital corridors was almost unbearable. Nurses whispered when Malcolm Rivers passed. Security guards tightened their stance near the elevators. It wasn't paranoia. Word had spread that Charles Denton himself had been seen entering the hospital 2 nights earlier, slipping through a service entrance. Malcolm had no proof, but he could feel the man's shadow in every corner. Camille Hayes arrived with a laptop under her arm and urgency in her step. "It's time," she said, without preamble. "Time for what?" Malcolm asked. Looking up from Isaiah's bedside, where he'd been reading a book aloud, his voice soft so his son could rest. "A press conference," Camille replied. "The evidence from Elena. The audio file you received. The motion we won yesterday, it's momentum. But momentum dies if you keep it behind closed doors. Denton owns the whisper networks. We need to own the headlines." Malcolm hesitated. His instinct was always to keep matters private, to protect his son from the glare of cameras. But Camille leaned forward, her tone gentle. "This isn't about publicity. It's about protection. Denton thrives in silence and shadows. If we put the truth out there, he can't manipulate the system so easily." By noon, Malcolm stood at the front of a modest conference room inside the Boston Legal Aid offices. The space was small, plain, but already packed with journalists, cameras, and microphones. Beside him stood Camille, and behind them a coalition of unexpected allies, members of the Veterans Justice Coalition, the Children's Health Advocacy Network, and even a few clergy leaders who had heard about the Parker case and wanted to lend their moral weight. Malcolm's palms were damp as he stepped up to the podium. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't trained for speeches, but he thought of Isaiah Small, fragile, asking in a broken whisper if he had done something wrong. The memory gave him strength. "My name is Malcolm Rivers," he began, his voice steady despite the cameras clicking. "I am a father. I am a business owner. And I am here because my 8-year-old son, Isaiah, was assaulted on a flight by a man who thought his wealth and his skin color gave him permission to harm a child." The room went still. He continued. What followed was not justice, but a campaign of intimidation. "Our home has been searched without cause. My medical privacy has been violated. My son's care has been compromised. And all of it traces back to one man, Charles Denton." He paused, letting the name hang heavy in the air. Reporters scribbled furiously. Malcolm gestured to Camille, who held up a printed transcript of the authenticated audio file. "This is Mr. Denton's voice, recorded just days ago. In it, he instructs associates to use the child welfare system as a weapon against my family. To make sure I crack." A murmur swept through the room. Malcolm took a breath. "This is not just about me. This is not just about my son. This is about how power and privilege can warp the very systems meant to protect the vulnerable. If they can do this to us, what happens to the families without lawyers, without press attention, without resources?" By the time he finished, the conference room was buzzing with questions. Camille fielded the sharpest ones with her characteristic precision, making clear that they had authenticated evidence and were preparing filings in both state and federal courts. The story spread quickly. Within hours, national outlets picked it up. By evening, Denton was forced onto the defensive, releasing a statement through his media group calling the press conference a coordinated smear campaign designed to exploit a child for political gain. But the tide was shifting. Social media flooded with outrage, hashtags trending within minutes. "Justice for Isaiah," "Power and privilege," "Hands off our children." Strangers from across the country shared stories of facing bias in schools, hospitals, airports everywhere. The shadow of discrimination lingered. Denton was no longer just a man accused. He was a symbol, and the cracks in his empire widened. That night, Malcolm returned to the hospital exhausted but hopeful. Isaiah stirred as he entered. "Daddy, did you win?" the boy mumbled. Malcolm knelt, kissing his forehead. "We're winning. Son, step by step." Later, Camille joined him in the family lounge with coffee that tasted burnt but comforting. She lowered her voice. "There's more. Sarah Lopez, the former employee who reached out. She's ready to testify. She says she has emails proving Denton ordered discriminatory practices in his company's hiring. It paints a broader pattern. Malcolm nodded slowly, the pieces of their case knitting together. Then we move fast, before he finds a way to silence her, as if summoned by the thought. Camille's phone buzzed. Her face darkened as she read the message. Marcus just called. Sarah's apartment was broken into tonight. Her laptop and phone are gone. Malcolm exhaled sharply, Denton's tightening his grip. But Camille shook her head. No, he's making mistakes. The more desperate he becomes, the sloppier he gets. If we can keep Sarah safe, her testimony could be the final nail. Malcolm rubbed his temples, weary but resolute. Then that's our job now. Protect her. Protect Isaiah. And keep pressing until Denton has nowhere left to hide. The next morning, as Malcolm walked down the hospital corridor to Isaiah's room, he noticed something different. Nurses who had once avoided eye contact now gave him small nods of encouragement. A janitor paused to say, "Saw you on the news last night. Stay strong." For the first time since the nightmare began, Malcolm felt the faint but unmistakable warmth of momentum. Denton still had power, but Malcolm and his allies had something stronger, truth, amplified by a public that was no longer willing to look away. The morning after the press conference, Malcolm Rivers woke to the sharp trill of his phone. He had dozed off in the stiff hospital chair again. Isaiah's hand curled in his. Camille Hayes's voice came through the line, clipped and urgent. "Turn on Channel 4. Now." Malcolm fumbled for the remote, careful not to disturb his son. The hospital television flickered to life. There was Charles Denton, seated in a glossy studio, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression composed, but injured. The chyron beneath him read, "Philanthropist responds to allegations." "I am appalled," Denton said smoothly. "What we saw yesterday was a cruel exploitation of a sick child. Mr. Rivers is clearly overwhelmed, and I sympathize with his struggles as a single father. But these accusations are baseless. I have dedicated my life to charitable causes. Anyone who knows me understands this smear campaign is nothing but an attempt to extort money and tarnish my reputation." Malcolm's stomach tightened as the anchor leaned forward. "So you deny having any involvement in Mr. Rivers's legal troubles or in decisions related to his son's care?" "Absolutely," Denton replied without hesitation. "I've been the target of false claims before. It comes with success. But this is beyond the pale." He paused dramatically. "To the families watching, I say this: I will not be bullied. And I will continue to support the institutions that protect children, even when others weaponize them for personal gain." The segment ended with Denton receiving a sympathetic pat on the arm from the host. Camille's voice crackled again through the phone. "He's flipping the script, painting himself as the victim." Malcolm muted the television, fury simmering under his calm exterior. "And people will believe him. That's his gift. He lies with charm." "Which is why we need to stay 2 steps ahead," Camille said firmly. The audio file rattled him. "That interview, it's damage control. He knows the walls are closing in." Malcolm hung up and turned back to Isaiah. The boy stirred, blinking against the sterile morning light. "Why is that man on TV again?" he asked weakly. Malcolm knelt beside him. "Because he's afraid, son. Afraid of the truth." Isaiah's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Then we're winning." Later that day, Malcolm met Camille in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria. She spread papers across the table, legal briefs, witness statements, and a fresh report. "Sarah Lopez is ready to testify, but she's shaken after the break-in. We'll need to relocate her until the hearing." Can we trust witness protection? Malcolm asked. Camille hesitated. Not fully. Denton has too many connections. But Marcus Daniels and his veterans group have volunteered to provide private security. They've already moved her to a safe house. Malcolm exhaled. Good. She's brave to step forward. Camille's eyes softened. So are you. Don't forget that. But bravery didn't shield them from what came next. By afternoon, news alerts buzzed across every phone. Court orders emergency review of Isaiah Rivers' custody case. Malcolm froze mid-step in the corridor, reading the headline twice. They're trying again, he muttered. Camille cursed under her breath when she saw it. Judge Alcott scheduled the hearing for tomorrow morning. Too soon. Denton's fingerprints are all over this. That night, Malcolm barely slept. He sat in Isaiah's room, the glow of the monitors painting his face in shifting light. His mind churned with possibilities. What if the court ordered Isaiah back into state custody? What if Denton succeeded in painting him unstable, negligent, unfit? He thought of fleeing, packing up, vanishing into another city, maybe another country, Canada, perhaps. Somewhere Denton's reach would falter. But then he looked at Isaiah, sleeping peacefully at last, and shook the thought away. Running would only prove Denton right, and his son deserved more than a life lived in hiding. At dawn, Malcolm splashed cold water on his face in the hospital bathroom, gripping the sink until his knuckles whitened. His reflection looked back at him tired, worn, but resolute. When the time came, the courtroom was nearly empty. Denton's team had ensured the hearing was scheduled with little notice. Judge Alcott presided, his expression carefully neutral. The Department of Family Services presented first. Investigator Calloway, polished and composed, listed the supposed concerns: housing instability, inconsistent schooling, risky medical decisions. Malcolm clenched his jaw as each point landed like a hammer. Then it was Camille's turn. She rose with quiet fire. Your Honor, these so-called concerns ignore the reality. Mr. Rivers has faced deliberate interference orchestrated by Mr. Denton, whose influence has compromised hospitals, caseworkers, and even prior court proceedings. We have authenticated audio proving intent to weaponize the system against this family. We have witnesses prepared to testify. This is not negligence. This is persecution. She played a short clip of Denton's voice for the court. The sound echoed through the hushed chamber. Make sure the boy's caseworker keeps the pressure on. Judge Alcott shifted uneasily. Denton's attorney objected, calling it inadmissible. But the damage was done. The judge ordered the clip entered into preliminary review. Still, the tension was unbearable as Alcott leaned forward, steepling his fingers. This case presents troubling contradictions. On one hand, we see a child in fragile health. On the other, evidence of potential external interference. His gaze swept the room. Until further review, Isaiah Rivers will remain under his father's care, with all medical decisions overseen by the independent ethics committee already appointed. Relief swept over Malcolm so suddenly he nearly collapsed. He gripped Camille's arm, whispering, "Thank you." But outside the courthouse, the fight continued. Reporters swarmed, firing questions. Malcolm spoke briefly, his words deliberate. This isn't just about my son. It's about every family who's ever been silenced by wealth and power. We will not be silenced. The crowd of supporters, veterans, parents, activists cheered. For the first time, Malcolm felt the tide truly turning. That evening, back at the hospital, he sat by Isaiah's bed with renewed hope. The boy's color was better, his voice stronger. Did the judge believe us? Isaiah asked. Malcolm smiled faintly. He heard the truth, and that's the first step. Isaiah nodded, drifting toward sleep. Then we just have to keep telling it. Malcolm squeezed his hand, heart swelling with pride. That's exactly right. Son, 2 nights after the custody hearing, Malcolm Rivers drove cautiously along a winding country road outside Chicago. The city's lights had long since faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by dark trees and the occasional farmhouse porch glowing faintly in the distance. In the passenger seat sat Camille Hayes, scrolling through her phone, while in the back seat Isaiah dozed against a pillow, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. They were headed toward the safe house Marcus Daniels and his veterans group had secured. Sarah Lopez was already there. Hidden away under layers of secrecy Denton's people would struggle to penetrate. For Malcolm, the drive felt like stepping into another world, one where trust was currency and caution was survival. When they arrived, the safe house looked deceptively ordinary, a low, weathered farmhouse with chipped white paint and a wide porch. Marcus himself opened the door, his broad frame filling the doorway. His expression softened when he saw Isaiah. "Everything's ready," Marcus said quietly. "No one knows this location except the people in this room. You're safe here, inside." The air smelled faintly of wood smoke. The living room was simple, but warm patchwork quilts draped over the couch, a fire crackling in the hearth. Sarah Lopez stood near the mantel, her posture tense, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. She managed a small nod toward Malcolm. "Thank you for coming," she said. Malcolm set Isaiah gently on the couch, pulling a blanket over him. "Thank you for risking everything to speak out." Sarah exhaled shakily. "I almost didn't. When they broke into my apartment, I thought maybe this is bigger than me. Maybe I should just disappear. But then I saw your son's face on the news. I thought of all the kids I watched Denton's policies hurt. I couldn't stay silent." Camille pulled out a recorder. "We'll take your full statement tonight. The more detailed, the better. Every email, every directive you remember." Sarah's voice trembled at first but grew steadier as she spoke. She described how Denton had created unwritten rules in his real estate empire. Black families steered toward less desirable neighborhoods, contracts denied to minority-owned businesses, tenants threatened if they spoke out. "It was racism dressed in paperwork," she said bitterly. "I stayed because I needed the paycheck, but I kept copies. I knew someday it would matter." Malcolm listened intently, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Each detail was another puzzle piece, fitting neatly into the larger picture of Denton's corruption. After hours of testimony, Sarah's voice grew hoarse. Camille clicked off the recorder and said gently, "That's enough for tonight. You've done more than enough." Marcus appeared with mugs of tea, setting one in front of each of them. "You've all got a long fight ahead. But you've got allies, too. Don't forget that." That night, Malcolm found himself unable to sleep. He stepped out onto the porch, the air cold against his skin. The sky stretched wide with stars. He thought of his father, a man who had worked 2 jobs but still struggled against invisible walls. He thought of his mother's quiet strength, the way she had always said, "The truth is heavy, but it sets you free." The porch creaked, and Sarah joined him, wrapped in a blanket. "I keep wondering," she murmured, "what if we lose? What if Denton buries us all?" Malcolm didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then at least we'll know we tried. At least Isaiah will know his father didn't back down." Silence hung between them, heavy but not hopeless. By morning, Isaiah's laughter, soft but real, echoed through the farmhouse kitchen as Marcus cooked pancakes. It was the first time Malcolm had heard that sound in weeks. It felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. But the peace didn't last long. A black SUV appeared at the end of the gravel driveway around noon. Everyone tensed, but Marcus strode outside calmly, hand resting near the weapon at his hip. The SUV idled for a moment, then turned and drove away, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. "Recon," Marcus muttered when he came back in. "They're sniffing. They don't know exactly where you are yet, but they're close." The realization settled like a stone in Malcolm's gut. Denton's reach was longer than any of them had imagined. That evening, Camille received a call from Elena Denton. Her voice was strained but urgent. "Charles suspects I've been speaking to someone. He's tightened security. I don't know how much longer I can move without being watched, but I still have files, important ones. If I can get them to you, they'll prove he bribed state officials." Camille glanced at Malcolm. "Where can we meet?" Elena hesitated. "Not yet. I'll find a way. Just keep your son safe. Whatever happens, don't underestimate him. Charles is more desperate than ever." The line went dead. That night, as Isaiah slept soundly upstairs, Malcolm sat with Camille and Marcus by the fire. The safe house felt secure, but the world outside pressed in on them. "We're close," Camille said quietly. "Closer than he realizes. If Elena delivers, and if Sarah testifies, we can break him." Malcolm nodded slowly, staring into the flames. "Then we hold the line. For Isaiah. For every family he's hurt, we hold the line." The fire crackled, sparks rising into the chimney. Outside, the dark pressed against the farmhouse walls. But inside there was light, and for now, it was enough. The morning at the safe house began quietly. Malcolm Rivers brewed coffee in the chipped enamel pot, the bitter aroma filling the farmhouse kitchen. Isaiah padded down the stairs in his socks, hair rumpled, eyes still heavy with sleep. For a fleeting moment, Malcolm let himself imagine this was just an ordinary morning in an ordinary life. But the illusion broke when Camille Hayes entered with her laptop under her arm, her expression taut. "Something happened overnight," she said, setting the device on the table. The Denton Group's internal emails, thousands of them, just leaked online. Anonymous source, hosted overseas. It's everywhere already. Malcolm leaned closer as she pulled up one of the files. The emails were damning instructions to manipulate housing contracts, conversations with politicians about backroom deals, even jokes about steering black families away from certain neighborhoods. It was systemic racism spelled out in black and white. No euphemisms, no plausible deniability. Sarah Lopez entered from the living room, still in sweatpants, her face pale. "That's my archive," she whispered. "The one I thought they stole when they broke into my apartment. Someone had a copy." Camille's eyes flicked up. Who else could have had access? Sarah shook her head. "Only one person. Elena. She knew I was keeping records. I told her once, years ago. I thought she dismissed it." Malcolm straightened slowly. "If Elena leaked this, it means she's finally making her move." But the relief was tempered by the immediate fallout. News outlets lit up with headlines. Emails expose racist practices in Denton Group. Cable anchors debated whether Charles Denton could survive the scandal. Protesters gathered outside his downtown headquarters by noon, holding signs that read, "Dignity is not for sale," and "Justice for Isaiah." Marcus Daniels came in from the porch, his phone pressed to his ear. "It's getting hot out there," he said grimly. "Crowds are swelling. and Denton sending private security to control the situation. This could get ugly fast. Isaiah, sitting at the table with a glass of milk, looked up at his father. "Daddy, are people mad because of me?" Malcolm crouched beside him, his hand resting gently on his shoulder. "No, son. They're mad because of him. Because he hurt you. And because he's hurt a lot of people. You just showed them it's okay to speak out." Isaiah blinked, absorbing the words, and nodded solemnly. By evening, the farmhouse living room had turned into a command center. Laptops hummed, phones buzzed, papers were scattered across the coffee table. Camille coordinated with journalists, ensuring the story stayed centered on the truth rather than Denton's spin. Sarah drafted her official statement, her hands trembling, but her resolve solid. Malcolm paced the room, the weight of it all pressing on him. The leak was a victory, but it also escalated the war. Denton would not go quietly. His phone rang again, the screen flashing an unfamiliar number. He hesitated, then answered. "Malcolm, it's Elena." Her voice was low, urgent. "You saw the leak." "Yes," he said carefully. "Was it you?" A pause. "Yes, but there's more. The emails are just the surface. I still have documents that prove direct payments to state officials, bribes, contracts, even medical cover-ups. If those come out, Charles is finished. Then why not release them all now?" Malcolm asked. "Because timing matters," Eleanor replied. "If everything drops at once, Denton will claim it's fake, orchestrated. But if it trickles out, piece by piece, he'll be too busy scrambling to contain the fire or to mount a defense." Before Malcolm could respond, the line crackled, then cut. He stared at the phone, unease gnawing at him. That night, the farmhouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress under siege. Marcus doubled the perimeter checks, veterans moving silently through the shadows with rifles slung across their backs. The others tried to sleep, but Malcolm remained by the fire. Isaiah curled against him. His son's breathing was steady, but Malcolm's mind raced. Every move they made felt like a step deeper into a storm. Near midnight, Camille joined him. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "When this is over and it will end, you'll have a choice. You can go back to your company, your life before, or you can step into something bigger. People are looking to you now. Malcolm, they see a father who stood up, a man who wouldn't be silenced." Malcolm shook his head. "I didn't choose this. I just wanted to protect my son." Camille gave a faint smile. Sometimes that's all it takes to lead. Outside, the wind howled against the farmhouse walls. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of sirens echoed across the night. By dawn, news broke the protesters had clashed with Denton's security forces downtown. Dozens were injured. Video footage showed guards pushing women, dragging men into vans. The outrage doubled overnight. Politicians who once cozied up to Denton scrambled to distance themselves. Malcolm turned off the television, his face set with quiet determination. "He's unraveling," he said. "But desperate men are dangerous." Sarah looked at him from across the room, her voice hoarse. "Then we have to be braver than we've ever been." Isaiah stirred on the couch, rubbing his eyes. "Daddy, is it almost over?" Malcolm pulled him close. "Not yet, son, but we're closer every day." The farmhouse woke to the sound of Marcus Daniels' boots pounding up the porch steps. He burst through the door, his voice sharp. "Turn on the TV. Now!" Camille Hayes fumbled for the remote, and the screen lit with breaking news banners. The image was chaotic. Denton's downtown headquarters engulfed in flames, black smoke curling into the morning sky. Reporters shouted over the sirens. their words tumbling one after another explosion. Multiple injured. Fire spreading through adjacent buildings. Malcolm Rivers stood frozen, Isaiah clinging to his side. Was it an accident, he asked, though his gut already told him otherwise. Camille shook her head grimly. No, Denton is staging his own chaos. He'll use this to shift the narrative, to call himself the victim again. As if on cue, the broadcast cut to Denton himself, standing before microphones outside a hastily arranged press area. His suit was immaculate, though a smear of ash streaked his sleeve. His voice carried practiced outrage. "This is what happens when lies are weaponized," Denton declared. "My company, my employees attacked by extremists who have been incited by Mr. Rivers's false accusations. Enough is enough. I demand authorities act, not just against this violence, but against those who spread dangerous lies." Malcolm's fists clenched. He felt Isaiah's small hand squeeze tighter, sensing his father's fury. Sarah Lopez stepped forward, her voice shaking. "He's turning this against us. People will believe him." Marcus shook his head. "Not everyone. The emails are out there. People have seen too much already." But Malcolm knew Denton's genius was never in truth, it was in manipulation. He turned disasters into opportunities, always emerging looking stronger. The fire, whether staged or real, was his latest tool. By midday, opinion columns were split down the middle. Some condemned Denton as corrupt and dangerous. Others repeated his claims, painting Malcolm as the instigator of violence. Social media pulsed with arguments, hashtags battling for dominance. In the farmhouse living room, the tension was suffocating. Malcolm paced, unable to sit still. "We're losing control of the story. We can't just react anymore. We have to lead." Camille nodded. "Then we need to strike hard. Sarah's testimony, Elena's documents. We release them strategically. Denton wants to play theatrics. Fine. We'll bury him in evidence." That evening, Elna Denton finally called again. Her voice was thin, as though she were speaking from a closet or stairwell. "He knows I leaked the emails. He's furious. He smashed a glass against the wall last night. I think he suspects I'm helping you." "Elena, you have to get out," Malcolm urged. "He's dangerous." "I can't yet," she whispered, "but I've secured the files. They prove he bribed 3 state officials to suppress housing discrimination investigations. If those come out, he's finished. I'll get them to you soon." Before Malcolm could answer, there was a muffled sound in the background, raised voices, heavy footsteps. Elena's breathing quickened. "I have to go. The line went dead." Malcolm lowered the phone slowly, dread curling in his stomach. Camille's eyes met his. "She's running out of time." That night, the farmhouse felt like a war room. Marcus mapped out possible escape routes if Denton's men found them. Sarah rehearsed her statement again and again, her voice steadier each time. Camille drafted motions for federal court, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Isaiah, sensing the tension, curled against his father on the couch. "Daddy, why does he hate us so much?" Malcolm stroked his son's hair, swallowing hard. "Because people like him are afraid of change. They're afraid of fairness. But we're not afraid. Are we?" Isaiah shook his head, his small voice resolute. "No." The following morning, the war escalated again. FBI agents arrived at the farmhouse, flashing badges. Marcus stiffened at the door, but Malcolm let them in cautiously. One of them, Agent Pierce, spoke firmly. "We've opened a federal investigation into Charles Denton. We believe the fire at his headquarters was staged to destroy evidence. We've also received credible threats against witnesses, including Ms. Lopez. Sarah paled. So I'm not safe here. We'll move you to a federal safe house, Pierce assured, but we'll need your cooperation and testimony. Sarah looked at Malcolm, fear flickering in her eyes. He gave a small nod. You won't be alone. We'll be right there. As the agents finalized arrangements, Camille whispered to Malcolm, this changes the game. If the feds are involved, Denton's control starts to crack. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Then it's time. We don't just defend ourselves anymore. We go on the attack. That evening, Malcolm stood once more before cameras, this time outside the federal courthouse. His words were measured, but burning with quiet fire. Charles Denton has spent decades weaponizing wealth and privilege to silence those he hurt. But today, for the first time, the truth is louder than his lies. We have evidence, we have witnesses, and we will not be intimidated. This is not just my fight, it's ours. And together, we will see justice done. The crowd erupted in cheers. Reporters shouted questions. But Malcolm's words had already landed where they mattered in the hearts of people who knew too well the weight of injustice. Back at the farmhouse that night, as Isaiah drifted to sleep, Malcolm sat by the fire with Camille and Marcus. The firestorm outside raged hotter than ever, but inside he felt something shift. For the first time, hope didn't feel fragile. It felt inevitable. Snow had begun to fall over Boston, soft flakes drifting against the farmhouse windows. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Malcolm Rivers sat at the kitchen table, papers spread before him. Camille Hayes leaned over his shoulder, pointing at a highlighted section of Elna Denton's leaked documents. This is it, she whispered. These payments trace directly to the housing authority officials. If we release this, it ties Denton to systemic discrimination, not just one assault on a plane. Malcolm rubbed his temples. It's strong. But is it strong enough to cut through his performance? He still has millions watching his every word. Marcus Daniels, standing guard near the door, interjected. That's why we hit him from multiple sides at once. You release the documents, Sarah testifies. I get veterans to speak out about Denton's contracts. It's harder to deny when it's coming from everywhere. Isaiah wandered in, holding his math workbook. Daddy, are you fighting the bad man again? His innocent voice softened the room. Malcolm pulled him close. I'm not just fighting. Son, I'm making sure people know the truth. Isaiah nodded, satisfied, then scampered back toward the living room. For a brief moment, silence fell, a rare, fragile peace. Then Malcolm's phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was ragged. Urgent. Mr. Rivers, it's Elena. He sat up straighter. Are you safe? No. He found out about the files. I barely got out. I'm at a motel outside Worcester. Room 6. But I can't stay long. He has people everywhere, Camille mouthed silently. Trapped Malcolm hesitated, but shook his head. Elena's voice trembled too much for it to be staged. Stay there. Don't move. We'll send someone we trust. They hung up, and Malcolm looked at Marcus. The veteran's jaw was set. I'll go. She's too important, but we need backup. By nightfall, Marcus was on the road, snow tires crunching over icy pavement. Camille watched him go, unease etched on her face. If Denton gets to her first, he'll bury everything she has. Back inside, Malcolm prepared for the upcoming hearing. Judge Alcott had scheduled an emergency review in 2 days. If they could present Elena's evidence in court, Denton's empire would begin to collapse publicly. Yet every instinct told Malcolm that Denton wouldn't allow it without a final play. His fears proved right. That night, the farmhouse was rocked awake by headlights sweeping across the front yard. Two SUVs idled at the edge of the drive. Malcolm's heart pounded. "Get Isaiah upstairs," he ordered Camille. She rushed the boy to safety while Malcolm stepped to the window, peering through the blinds. A knock thundered against the door. Federal agents. A voice called, "Open up." Malcolm's gut twisted. The timing was too perfect. He cracked the door an inch. Two men in dark coats held up badges. But something was wrong. Their stances were too rigid, their eyes too sharp. Not agents, mercenaries. Malcolm closed the door fast, throwing the lock. "They're Denton's men," he hissed. "Back." The men outside tried the handle, then kicked against the frame. Camille grabbed her phone, dialing Agent Pierce in desperation. "We're under threat. We need immediate assistance." The banging grew louder. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence pressed against the walls. Malcolm held his breath. Through the window, the SUVs backed down the drive and disappeared into the night. Camille exhaled shakily. They were testing us. Malcolm nodded grimly. A warning. Next time, they won't leave so quietly. Hours later, Marcus returned with Elena. She was pale, exhausted, but her eyes burned with determination. Clutching a worn leather folder, she set it on the table. "These are copies. Even if he destroys the originals, he can't erase this." Camille opened the folder carefully. Documents, photographs, financial transfers, years of Denton's corruption laid bare. It was more damning than any of them had imagined. Elena's hand shook as she poured herself a glass of water. "You need to understand he won't just fight this in court. He'll come after you with everything he has left. He's desperate." Malcolm met her gaze steadily. "So are we." The next day dawned cold and gray. Federal agents finally arrived to reinforce the farmhouse, setting up surveillance equipment and posting guards at the perimeter. For the first time, Malcolm allowed himself to breathe a little easier, but news from downtown shattered that calm. Denton had scheduled a massive press event in the city square. The teaser from his PR team promised irrefutable evidence that Malcolm Rivers had fabricated the entire case. Camille groaned, tossing the newspaper aside. "He's going to try to flip this. He'll use doctored evidence, character attacks, anything to discredit you." Malcolm leaned back, weary but resolute. "Then we make sure when the curtain falls, the truth is all anyone sees." That night, Sarah Lopez recorded her testimony with federal investigators. Her voice broke at times, but her words cut clear. "I saw Denton instruct supervisors to deny black families housing. I saw him order employees to shred complaints. And when I questioned it, I was threatened with losing my job." As she finished, she whispered to Malcolm, "I've carried this for years. I just want to be free of it." Malcolm placed a hand over hers. "You already are. Speaking out is freedom." Meanwhile, Marcus stood with Elena on the porch, both of them watching the snow fall. She shivered, wrapping her coat tighter. "I never thought I'd be on this side of things. I stayed silent for too long." Marcus nodded slowly. "Silence is survival. Until it isn't. You chose the harder path. That counts for something." Elena gave him a faint smile. "Do you really think we can win?" He looked back through the window, where Malcolm sat with Isaiah asleep on his lap, Camille drafting notes at his side. "We don't just win. We make sure Denton can never do this again." The farmhouse quieted as midnight approached, but Malcolm couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire. Elijah's steady breathing upstairs, Elena's folder on the table. He thought of everything at stake: the safety of his son, the courage of Sarah, the sacrifice of Elena. the loyalty of Marcus and Camille, and he thought of Denton, waiting, calculating, planning his final strike. When dawn broke, Malcolm rose with new resolve. Tomorrow, they would stand in court. Tomorrow, the world would see Charles Denton not as a king, but as a man stripped of his lies. The morning of the hearing arrived crisp and bitterly cold, the kind of day when even the courthouse steps seemed to shiver under the weight of anticipation. Reporters had gathered since dawn, microphones and cameras poised, their voices carrying the tension of a city waiting for a spectacle. Inside, courtroom 4B buzzed with low murmurs. The polished wood, high ceilings, and austere portraits of judges past lent the air of solemnity. But the undercurrent was electric. Charles Denton sat at the defense table, flanked by his high-priced attorneys. His suit was immaculate, his cufflinks gleaming, but his eyes betrayed the strain of the past weeks. He looked thinner, older, as if the fortress he'd built around himself was cracking from the inside. Across from him, Malcolm Rivers entered with Camille Hayes at his side, carrying folders thick with evidence. Sarah Lopez and Elena Denton sat behind them, under quiet federal protection. Marcus Daniels lingered at the back, his broad shoulders a silent wall of reassurance. Isaiah was absent safely at school, with trusted friends, but Malcolm carried his son's courage in every step. Judge Alcott called the room to order. This court will review allegations of systemic discrimination, witness intimidation, and corruption tied to Mr. Charles Denton and his affiliates. Counsel, proceed. Denton's lead attorney rose first, voice smooth, rehearsed. Your Honor, what we have here is a fabricated narrative designed to smear a respected businessman. Mr. Rivers has orchestrated a campaign of lies, abetted by disgruntled former employees and a bitter ex-spouse. We will present evidence proving not only Mr. Rivers's financial motive, but also his history of unstable behavior. The word stung, but Malcolm didn't flinch. He had expected worse. Camille rose next, her voice clear, calm, deliberate. Your Honor, this case is not about bitterness or personal vendettas. It is about power abused and lives shattered. We will show evidence of bribes, of threats, of deliberate discrimination carried out under Mr. Denton's direction. And most importantly, we will show the human cost families denied homes, workers silenced, a child assaulted. The first witness called was Sarah Lopez. She walked nervously to the stand, hands trembling as she took the oath. Camille guided her gently through testimony, drawing out details of meetings where Denton had ordered complaints destroyed, of moments when employees whispered fears but dared not resist. At one point, Sarah's voice cracked. He told us, they don't fit our brand. He was talking about black families applying for apartments. He laughed about it. Gaffes rippled through the courtroom. Denton's attorney objected, claiming hearsay, but Judge Alcott allowed the testimony. Next came the documents Elena had risked everything to provide. Camille displayed copies of bank transfers on the courtroom projector payments from Denton-controlled shell companies to officials who had conveniently shut down investigations. Elena took the stand after, her presence drawing a sharp glare from her ex-husband. She spoke steadily, though the weight of years of silence pressed on her voice. I stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing my livelihood, afraid of what Charles would do. But when I saw what he did to Isaiah Rivers on that plane, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had the documents. I knew I had to bring them forward. Denton's attorney tore into her on cross-examination. So you admit you broke a non-disclosure agreement, Mrs. Denton, that you stand to gain financially from destroying Mr. Denton's reputation? Elena met his eyes without flinching. The only thing I stand to gain is peace. The peace of knowing I didn't let him hurt another child. The jury brought in to weigh specific charges watched intently, their faces unreadable. But Malcolm noticed one juror, an older black man, nod ever so slightly as Elna spoke. It gave him hope. Midway through the day, Denton himself insisted on testifying against the advice of his lawyers. He took the stand with practiced indignation, painting himself as the victim of a vendetta. I have spent my life building homes, businesses, opportunities, he proclaimed, and now I am being vilified by a man who seeks money and attention. These accusations are not just false, they are dangerous. Camille rose for cross-examination, her voice like a scalpel. Mr. Denton, are you denying that these payments she held up copies of bank transfers came from your company? I don't manage every transaction, Denton said smoothly. And are you denying that you struck Isaiah Rivers on that flight I prevented a disturbance? Denton snapped, his composure slipping. The recording Marcus had recovered from the plane played then, filling the courtroom with Denton's own voice. Keep your filthy hands off my seat, followed by the audible slap, the child's cry, and his racially charged threats. The silence afterward was absolute. Denton's face darkened. That's doctored, he shouted, but the jury's eyes told another story. The prosecution rested its case with that recording still echoing in everyone's ears. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, shouting questions, their cameras capturing Denton's scowl as he was ushered into a waiting car. Malcolm stood briefly before microphones, speaking softly but firmly. This is not just about me or my son. This is about a system that lets men like Charles Denton harm others without consequence. Today, we took a step toward ending that. And tomorrow, we will take another. That night, back at the farmhouse, exhaustion hung heavy over the group. Sarah sat curled in a blanket, her nerves still raw. Elna stared into the fire, quiet but resolute. Marcus polished the side of his prosthetic leg absent-mindedly, his eyes on the window as though expecting Denton's men to appear again. Malcolm tucked Isaiah into bed, the boy's questions tugging at his heart. Daddy, will the bad man go to jail? Malcolm hesitated, then kissed his son's forehead. I don't know yet, but I do know this: we won't stop until he can't hurt anyone else. Downstairs. Camille closed her laptop with a sigh. We landed some hard blows today, but Denton's not done. His lawyers will appeal, stall, drag this out. He still has allies, and he's desperate. Malcolm joined her, his expression weary but unbroken. Then we keep pressing, one truth at a time, until there's nowhere left for him to hide. For a moment, silence reigned in the farmhouse, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Each of them carried scars from this battle, visible and invisible, but each knew they had crossed a threshold. Denton's mask had slipped in public. His empire was faltering, and while the war wasn't over, they were no longer on the defensive. They were winning. The courthouse steps the next morning were even more crowded than before. Protesters carried signs calling for justice, their chants echoing down the marble columns. No more Denton, no more lies. The air vibrated with anger and hope in equal measure. Inside, courtroom 4B was heavy with tension. Charles Denton had doubled his legal team overnight. His attorneys wheeled in stacks of boxes, a performance designed to intimidate, to suggest mountains of evidence in his favor. But Camille Hayes leaned toward Malcolm Rivers and whispered, "It's theater, smoke and mirrors. Don't let it rattle you." Judge Alcott entered, and the room snapped to order. The defense wasted no time. Denton's lead attorney rose with a swagger that bordered on arrogance. "Your Honor, The so-called recordings and documents the prosecution has presented are deeply questionable. We will demonstrate they were manipulated by parties with a clear vendetta. Furthermore, we have uncovered Mr. Rivers' own financial irregularities that cast doubt on his credibility. A projector flickered on, displaying spreadsheets meant to imply mismanagement at Malcolm's company. But Camille was ready. She stood, calm and unshaken. Your Honor, these documents have already been reviewed by federal auditors. They found no evidence of wrongdoing. This is a deliberate distraction from the very real crimes of Charles Denton. The judge's eyes narrowed. Unless the defense can provide verifiable evidence, I will not allow this line of argument to continue. Denton's attorney bristled, but stepped back. Denton himself sat rigid, his knuckles white against the polished wood of the defense table. He had gambled on a smear campaign, but it was slipping through his fingers. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Camille called her final witness Derek Lawson, the veteran who had stood up mid-flight when Denton struck Isaiah. He walked with a limp, but carried himself with quiet strength. Taking the stand, he looked directly at Denton, his voice steady. I was there. I saw him hit that boy. And I saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't anger at a child. It was hatred, pure and ugly. The courtroom hushed. Lawson continued, I've fought in wars. I've seen men at their worst. But what I saw that day on that plane was different. It was a man who believed he could do anything to anyone and walk away untouched. Denton's attorney tried to shake him on cross-examination. Mr. Lawson, aren't you suffering from PTSD? Isn't it possible your memory is clouded? Lawson's eyes hardened. My memory is sharp enough to remember the sound of that boy crying, and it's sharp enough to know the truth doesn't change just because it makes powerful men uncomfortable. A ripple of applause broke out before Judge Alcott banged the gavel. Order. By the time Lawson stepped down, the tide had turned decisively. The defense, desperate, played their last card a character witness. To the shock of many, they called a city councilman long known for his ties to Denton. He testified that Denton had donated millions to housing programs, painting him as a philanthropist. But Camille was ruthless on cross. Councilman, isn't it true that after receiving those donations, you voted against expanding affordable housing in minority neighborhoods? The man stammered. I acted in the city's best interest, or in Mr. Denton's best interest. Camille pressed. The witness crumbled, and the jury's eyes told the story no credibility left. Denton slammed a hand on the table, his composure finally shattering. This is a witch hunt, he barked. Do you people have any idea who I am? Judge Alcott's voice was icy. Sit down, Mr. Denton, or I will hold you in contempt. Malcolm watched, a strange calm settling over him. The man who had terrorized his family, who had wielded wealth like a weapon, was unraveling in front of everyone. When court adjourned for the day, the steps outside exploded with energy. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, questions flying. Malcolm spoke briefly, his words chosen with care. This case was never about wealth or power. It was about dignity, about a child who deserved safety, about families who deserved fairness, and about the truth, which no fire, no lie, no intimidation can bury forever. The crowd roared approval. Some wept openly. Others chanted his name. That night, back at the farmhouse, exhaustion pressed heavy on them all. Sarah Lopez dozed on the couch. Elna Denton sat quietly with a cup of tea, and Marcus Daniels checked the perimeter for the 100th time. Camille sat with Malcolm by the fire, both too wired to sleep. You realize Camille said softly. If Denton falls, people will look to you as more than just the man who stood up to him. They'll look to you as a leader. Malcolm shook his head slowly. I didn't ask for that. No one ever does, she replied. But leadership isn't about asking. It's about answering when the moment calls. Upstairs, Isaiah stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly. Malcolm rose to check on him, brushing a hand gently across his son's forehead. For the first time in weeks, the boy's rest was peaceful. Downstairs, Marcus stood at the window, watching the snow fall. It's almost over, he murmured. But even as hope warmed the farmhouse, Malcolm knew Denton had one more move to play. Desperate men rarely surrendered quietly, and tomorrow the world would see which side of history Charles Denton chose for his final stand. The courthouse was silent as the jury filed back into the room. Hours had passed since deliberations began, but to Malcolm Rivers it felt like days. He sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded tightly. Camille Hayes beside him. Behind them, Sarah Lopez and Elena Denton leaned forward, their faces pale with tension. Marcus Daniels stood in the back row, his arms crossed, eyes locked on the jurors as if daring anyone to falter. At the defense table, Charles Denton sat rigid, jaw clenched, his attorneys whispering frantically in his ear. The once untouchable mogul looked smaller now, his skin ashen under the harsh courtroom lights. Still, his eyes gleamed with defiance. He believed, even in this moment, that power could shield him. Judge Alcott cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with steady eyes, rose. We have, Your Honor. She handed the paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The room seemed to hold its breath as Judge Alcott read silently, then returned the paper. On the charge of systemic housing discrimination, we find the defendant, Charles Denton, guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation, guilty. On the charge of assault against a minor, guilty. Gas filled the courtroom. Denton's attorneys leapt to their feet, shouting objections, but the gavel struck sharply. Order the verdict stands. Malcolm felt his chest loosen, a weight lifting that he hadn't realized was pressing so heavily. He looked at Camille, who exhaled with relief. Sarah wept silently, her hands shaking. Elena's eyes closed, as though releasing years of held breath. Marcus allowed himself the smallest of nods, but across the aisle, Denton erupted. This is a sham bought and paid for, he shouted, slamming his fists against the table. You'll all regret this. I'll bury every last one of you. 2 federal marshals moved in, gripping his arms. But he thrashed violently, his voice cracked with fury. You think this ends me. I built this city. You can't erase me. Judge Alcott's voice cut through the chaos, firm and unyielding. Mr. Denton, you will control yourself or be removed from this courtroom. Denton spat on the floor, his face twisted in rage, but the marshals restrained him. For the first time, the image of invincibility shattered completely. Outside, the courthouse steps were alive with noise. Protesters cheered, reporters shouted questions, camera flashes lit the sky like lightning. When Malcolm emerged, Isaiah by his side for the first time since the trial began, the crowd erupted into chants. Justice, justice, justice. Isaiah clutched his father's hand tightly, eyes wide at the sea of faces. Daddy, are they cheering for us? Malcolm knelt down, pulling his son close. They're cheering because the truth won. Son, because you were brave. Tears filled the boy's eyes, but this time they were not from fear. They were from pride. Malcolm stepped up to the microphones, his voice steady despite the roar around him. Today is not just about my family. It is about every family who has been told they are less than. It is about the workers threatened into silence, the tenants denied dignity, the children made to believe they don't belong. Charles Denton thought his power was greater than the truth. But today, we proved him wrong. Justice is not perfect, and it is not always swift, but it is possible when people refuse to back down. The cheers rose, echoing down the city streets. That evening, the farmhouse felt different, lighter. Sarah Lopez sat with a soft smile, relief finally easing her features. Elena sipped tea quietly, staring into the fire with a look of peace she hadn't worn in years. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written across his face, but pride in his eyes. Camille tapped away at her laptop, drafting motions to ensure Denton's sentence stuck. But even she allowed herself a rare laugh when Isaiah bounced through the room with excitement. Malcolm stepped onto the porch, the winter air crisp against his skin. He looked up at the stars, their quiet brilliance steady and eternal. For the first time in months, he let himself believe in the possibility of healing. Elena joined him after a while, her coat pulled tight. "It's over," she said softly. Malcolm shook his head. "Not over, but we've turned a corner. The rest is rebuilding." She nodded. "I'll testify at sentencing, and then I'll start over somewhere far from him." Malcolm placed a hand on the railing, the wood rough under his palm. "Starting over isn't weakness, it's strength. You chose to break the silence. That matters." Back inside. Isaiah sat at the table, drawing a picture with crayons. He held it up proudly when his father returned 2 figures holding hands beneath a bright sun, a crowd cheering around them. "It's us," he said simply. Malcolm knelt beside him, studying the picture. "It's beautiful. Isaiah, you know what it means?" The boy nodded. "It means we're safe now." And for the first time, Malcolm believed him. The days that followed brought headlines across the nation. Denton found guilty, justice for Isaiah, turning point in housing equality. Commentators called it a landmark case, a reckoning not just for one man, but for a system that had allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. But for Malcolm, the true victory was quieter, his son's laughter returning, Sarah's newfound courage, Elena's freedom, Marcus's steady companionship, Camille's unwavering resolve. These were the pieces of healing, fragile but real. The night after the verdict, as the farmhouse finally settled into stillness, Malcolm whispered a prayer his mother had once taught him, for strength to fight, for wisdom to know when it's won, and for grace to begin again. The fire crackled softly. Upstairs, Isaiah dreamed without fear. Outside, the snow fell gently, covering the world in white, and for the first time in a long time, tomorrow looked like hope. The courthouse was silent as the jury filed back into the room. Hours had passed since deliberations began, but to Malcolm Rivers it felt like days. He sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded tightly. Camille Hayes beside him, behind them. Sarah Lopez and Elena Denton leaned forward, their faces pale with tension. Marcus Daniels stood in the back row, his arms crossed, eyes locked on the jurors as if daring anyone to falter. At the defense table, Charles Denton sat rigid, jaw clenched, his attorneys whispering frantically in his ear. The once untouchable mogul looked smaller now, his skin ashen under the harsh courtroom lights. Still, his eyes gleamed with defiance. He believed, even in this moment, that power could shield him. Judge Alcott cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with steady eyes, rose. "We have, Your Honor." She handed the paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The room seemed to hold its breath as Judge Alcott read silently, then returned the paper. On the charge of systemic housing discrimination, we find the defendant, Charles Denton, guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation, guilty. On the charge of assault against a minor, guilty. Gasps filled the courtroom. Denton's attorneys leapt to their feet, shouting objections, but the gavel struck sharply. Order, the verdict stands. Malcolm felt his chest loosen, a weight lifting that he hadn't realized was pressing so heavily. He looked at Camille, who exhaled with relief. Sarah wept silently, her hands shaking. Elena's eyes closed, as though releasing years of held breath. Marcus allowed himself the smallest of nods. But across the aisle, Denton erupted. This is a sham. Bought and paid for, he shouted, slamming his fists against the table. You'll all regret this. I'll bury every last one of you. 2 federal marshals moved in, gripping his arms, but he thrashed violently. His voice cracked with fury. You think this ends me? I built this city. You can't erase me. Judge Alcott's voice cut through the chaos, firm and unyielding. Mr. Denton, you will control yourself or be removed from this courtroom. Denton spat on the floor, his face twisted in rage, but the marshals restrained him. For the first time, the image of invincibility shattered completely. Outside, the courthouse steps were alive with noise. Protesters cheered. Reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes lit the sky like lightning. When Malcolm emerged, Isaiah by his side for the first time since the trial began, the crowd erupted into chants. Justice! 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 Isaiah clutched his father's hand tightly, eyes wide at the sea of faces. Daddy? Are they cheering for us? Malcolm knelt down, pulling his son close. They're cheering because the truth won. Son, because you were brave. Tears filled the boy's eyes, but this time they were not from fear. They were from pride. Malcolm stepped up to the microphones, his voice steady despite the roar around him. Today is not just about my family. It is about every family who has been told they are less than. It is about the workers threatened into silence, the tenants denied dignity, the children made to believe they don't belong. Charles Denton thought his power was greater than the truth. But today, we proved him wrong. Justice is not perfect, and it is not always swift. But it is possible when people refuse to back down. The cheers rose, echoing down the city streets. That evening, the farmhouse felt different. Lighter. Sarah Lopez sat with a soft smile, relief finally easing her features. Elena sipped tea quietly, staring into the fire with a look of peace she hadn't worn in years. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written across his face, but pride in his eyes. Camille tapped away at her laptop, drafting motions to ensure Denton's sentence stuck. But even she allowed herself a rare laugh when Isaiah bounced through the room with excitement. Malcolm stepped onto the porch, the winter air crisp against his skin. He looked up at the stars, their quiet brilliance steady and eternal. For the first time in months, he let himself believe in the possibility of healing. Elena joined him after a while, her coat pulled tight. It's over, she said softly. Malcolm shook his head. Not over, but we've turned a corner. The rest is rebuilding. She nodded. I'll testify at sentencing, and then I'll start over somewhere far from him. Malcolm placed a hand on the railing, the wood rough under his palm. Starting over isn't weakness, it's strength. You chose to break the silence. That matters. Back inside. Isaiah sat at the table, drawing a picture with crayons. He held it up proudly when his father returned 2 figures holding hands beneath a bright sun, a crowd cheering around them. "It's us," he said simply. Malcolm knelt beside him, studying the picture. "It's beautiful. Isaiah, you know what it means." The boy nodded. "It means we're safe now." And for the first time, Malcolm believed him. The days that followed brought headlines across the nation. Denton found guilty. Justice for Isaiah. Turning point in housing equality. Commentators called it a landmark case, a reckoning not just for one man, but for a system that had allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. But for Malcolm, the true victory was quieter. His son's laughter returning, Sarah's newfound courage, Elena's freedom, Marcus's steady companionship, Camille's unwavering resolve. These were the pieces of healing, fragile but real. The night after the verdict, as the farmhouse finally settled into stillness, Malcolm whispered a prayer his mother had once taught him, for strength to fight, for wisdom to know when it's won, and for grace to begin again. The fire crackled softly. Upstairs, Isaiah dreamed without fear. Outside, the snow fell gently, covering the world in white, and for the first time in a long time, tomorrow looked like hope. Thank you for sharing your time and heart with us today. Stories like this remind us that dignity, courage, and compassion are values worth defending every day. If this story touched you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep these conversations alive and continue building a community that believes in justice and hope.